All right, we are live. So people will be joining here over the next couple of minutes. As you see, we have Chas Ballew today of Aptible. The attendee numbers are going up. Awesome. All right, thank you guys for joining us. If you have questions that you want to ask, make sure that we ask them using the Q&A button during today's webinar. You should see that at either the bottom or the top of your screen. And we're here, we're talking about GDPR, how GDPR affects sales teams and why that matters. So this has been a very hot topic in my inbox over the past couple of weeks. I see about a dozen emails a day related to GDPR. And we got a lot of questions from you guys, several hundred actually. But today we have Chas Ballew from Aptible here. Chas, would you introduce yourself and Aptible? Tell everyone what you do.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name's Chas. The company is Aptible. I'm the CEO and the co-founder, and we make tools to help teams on the internet protect data. So we make a security management platform called Gridiron that helps companies stand up and run security and privacy management programs like GDPR, ISO 27001, SOC 2, and HIPAA. My background is as a developer and a lawyer, and I'm also there's a International Association of Privacy Professionals, like a privacy trade group that does a certification for certified information privacy professionals. So I have a specific certification from that group for European data privacy law, and I've spent the last several months really trying to understand and think deeply about what is GDPR, how does it work, how does it affect teams, including growth teams, marketing teams, sales teams, product teams, customer success teams, HR teams, like across the board. But especially, I'm very excited to talk about sales teams today.
Yes, awesome. Well, Chas, thank you for joining us. So I want to ask the question that we got by far the most first. You know, a bunch of different variations of this, but essentially, how is GDPR going to affect cold emailing when you're using different tools like Hunter.io or maybe something that's scraping contact information from LinkedIn? How is GDPR going to affect that process that I know so many of our people watching today use?
Yeah, really good question. So any kind of like demand gen, outbound processes like that, would it be helpful to talk a little bit about, for those, a lot of people were like, can I do this? Can I do that? Maybe a little bit about like, how does GDPR work? And then that'll make the answer that I give after I give that, you know, we explain that a bit, it'll make the
Let's do that
much clearer. Okay, so GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It is a regulation which is a form of law in the European Union that goes across the entire European Union, and it just becomes law on Friday, and it's in full effect, and it's the same everywhere, which is different than the way that data protection was regulated from 1995 until now, which is that it was just kind of like every state had to implement its own laws, and they're all kind of different, and it wasn't really like clear or easy what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to run as a business. The other big thing was that GDPR opened up the scope of companies that are responsible for complying with these obligations. So before, under the Data Protection Directive, it was really companies that are deciding how and why to use data, companies called data controllers. And really the Data Protection Directive focused on those. Now all kinds of companies have to worry about both not only controlling data, but also processing it. And that's what pulls a lot of SaaS companies and their services in scope. That said, when you're a sales and marketing team, you're going to be acting as a data controller usually, because you're going out, you're collecting leads, or you're trying to get leads through, you know, webinars like this or content generation activities, and then capture basically leads from there. That's what you do as a sales and marketing team, and you're what's called a data controller in that capacity as a sales team. So, okay, so you're a data controller. What do you have to do? Like, how does it work? Like, who cares? There are, first of all, there's three big changes or three big things you need to know about data and working with data that with especially data subjects in the EU that GDPR introduces. First is personal data that's identifiable. That's what's called the material scope of GDPR. It's identifiable data about people, even just an email address. That comes with responsibilities now. It's not just like, oh, we can just do whatever. Like you have to take care of it. You have to be careful how you collect it. You have to be careful how you use it. these responsibilities are outlined in a section of GDPR, and I'm not sure, we can probably, if you want, I can share a screen and walk through slides and or go through like GDPR itself and show you, or we can just talk about this. But if you find a copy of GDPR, let me just link everybody. I won't.
Yeah, let's do a link in the chat, and then we'll include a link too. We're going to publish a blog post with the recording of this webinar this afternoon, so we'll include it in there too, so people can check out your slides as well.
So everybody, if you're, this is a site that I like. Aptible will probably make a site where people can read the GDPR. But if you're looking for basically a basic outline of what you have to do under GDPR, Article 5 in GDPR is the place to look. And these are like the responsibilities that come. So you have to make sure that data is collected in a fair way, that you're transparent about what you're doing with it, and that you have what's called a legal basis for processing that data. And anything you do with data is processing it. So collecting it, using it, analyzing it, selling it, deleting it, storing it, anything you do is using data. And these principles are things like you have to define what you're going to do with the data before you collect it. And it has to be related to a specific purpose. Like what you're going to do is like your use of that data. And you have to make sure that you only collect enough data that you want to use to fulfill that purpose. It's called the minimization principle. You have to make sure it stays accurate. You have to make sure that you delete it when you're done with it and you don't keep it around too long. You have to secure it and make sure that it doesn't get breached. And then you're responsible for showing that you've done all of those things. It's called the accountability principle. So again, number one, big change under GDPR, data comes with responsibilities. And these are, this is a summary, Article 5 is a summary of those responsibilities, but that's a big shift for a lot of sales teams who are like, oh, I can just go like build leads, collect lead gen lists, I can go scrape, I can do whatever, I can collect a bunch of data and build, a campaign here. You have to take a pause and say, okay, how am I collecting this data? And do I have basically like a legal basis, or do I have like a justifiable reason? So that's one big change. A second big change for a lot, especially in the question to go directly to direct marketing and email, is that once you're pulled in under GDPR, the general data protection regulation, this is like an open question, and Ryan, I can even ask you, do you happen to know what is general? What part of GDPR is general? What does that mean? What does it mean to be the general data protection regulation?
I do not know.
Good question, right? General in the context of GDPR, sometimes people think it's like, oh, general data, like data around that's
that would have been my assumption.
Right, yeah, and it's like, what kind of data is general? No. So it's the data protection regulation. It regulates personal data. The general means it's non-specific. So get this, GDPR is like the baseline for all of Europe. And then there are some cases in which either you're the right kind of entity or you're using data in the right way, where there's a more specific legal obligation in place than GDPR. So GDPR is the baseline, and then there's something, good example, there's something called the Law Enforcement Data Protection Directive. So any police agencies and intelligence agencies and basically law enforcement officials in Europe, when they're processing data, they don't follow the general regulation, they follow the more specific one for law enforcement. There's also something called the e-privacy directive, which is really, really important to understand, and it's kind of a mess. The e-privacy directive was passed in the early 2000s, and like the data protection directive, it's been implemented differently in every different state. But it's really important for sales teams to know, because it restricts basically two things that you do all the time. And it says, okay, under GDPR, you can have these different, what are called lawful bases for processing. It can be consent, contract performance, it can be fulfilling a legal obligation, acting in the vital interest of somebody, carrying out a public task, or what's kind of like a catch-all one, which is called legitimate interest. You can basically say processing this data is in our interest, and we're balancing between the interest of you as an individual and our interest, and we win this one. And you have to give people certain obligations. So among those six, anytime you use data under GDPR, you get to pick one of those six and try to figure out, is the way we're using data, does it fall under this one of these six? And what is tricky, a lot of companies look at that and they're like, oh, legitimate interest for everything. Awesome. Yay. We just like do whatever we want. We'll scrape and just use legitimate interest. there's a catch though, and the e-privacy directive is the catch. Basically, it says if you're doing one of two things, you can't use anything except consent. You have to get consent if you're doing one of two things. First is if you're going to email somebody, any kind of electronic communication, texting, push notifications, email, stuff like that. Any kind of unsolicited contact is what they call it. You have to get consent for. That is the major thing that now a lot of companies, because they're getting pulled in under GDPR, they're waking up and they're saying, oh my God, we have to worry about Europe and European data protection. It's not just GDPR, it's actually the e-privacy directive, which is going to get turned into a regulation next year. And there's a handful of other like laws and things you need to worry about. So GDPR itself doesn't actually tell you what you can and can't do with like sales lists and emailing people, but the e-privacy directive does say like, oh, you have to get consent basically to email people. And that's its own, that's its own can of worms around that. The other thing for the e-privacy directive, just so this is mostly salespeople, but you might be using tools, I don't know, like Clearbit or like sales tracking tools, pixel drops in emails, anything like that, beacons. And if you're using anything that tracks people, tracks opens, tracks activity, builds profiles, anything like that, heads up, because the e-privacy directive also regulates use of tracking. Anything basically where there's any kind of data stored on a user's device, like on their phone or their browser, something like that, and then you're pulling it back later to identify them or track them or read them, you have to have consent to do that too. That's what the e-privacy directive says. So sales tools, marketing tools, it really affects marketing teams a lot because they build profiles and funnels. But sales teams, the difference sometimes is minimal, using a lot of the same tools and technologies.
Well, we've been getting a lot of questions specifically relating to this kind of catch-22 of like, how do I get consent from someone, speaking with the use case of outbound prospecting. So how do I get consent from them if I'm doing outbound prospecting before I email them to ask for consent or before I call them to ask for consent? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's tricky. So this is the big like tectonic shift in GDPR. If you're an account exec and you don't know how you got that email address, you can't use it. You can't, because you don't know, you're responsible for being accountable for using data under GDPR. And if you don't know whether you have permission to email somebody or not, you don't, right? So it's it's going to become really important for a lot of companies. Any business model or company that's using tactics or a business model that's basically predicated on being able to buy or sell or move or transfer people's data without the people actually knowing about it, or build profiles or collect information on people without the people actually like agreeing to it, consenting to it, is going to have a really tough time under GDPR. And that's the intent. That's kind of what Europe decided. They said, we want to make this stuff tougher to do. And what it's going to lead to across the industry, I think, is probably a big shift for a lot of SaaS companies to like double and triple down on content marketing, so that you can engage with somebody and talk to them in a way that's kind of like open, and then be like, yeah, you want to learn more? Give us your email, and collect that consent to market to them, and building lists organically.
You get something opted in.
Right, yeah, it's going to be really tough to pay somebody to build a list for you these days. With scraping in Europe, you basically can't do that. You're not going to be able to use the list. You can scrape the list, you can assemble it, and that involves legitimate interest, but then you're not going to be able to actually contact them and email them. So it's like, well, what do you do with that list? If you're an individual account exec, you're in the same position. Like, what do I do if I don't have clearance to email this person? Because imagine this scenario. You get a list and you're like, you know what? I'm just gonna do it. We'll see.
And I think maybe something to address too would be, is there a difference between throwing them into this automated email sequence versus, quick personal note from within Gmail? Is there a difference?
No, not for the e-privacy directive specifically talks about just any kind of unsolicited email. So it doesn't really matter like what the campaign or the background. It's basically, think about it from the perspective of the person who's receiving the email. They're like, what is this doing in my inbox? What is this? Who sent me this? And why did you email me? Right? And now in Europe, they are allowed to ask you, like, where did you get my information? I never consented to this. And you have to actually tell them. And if you don't, it just becomes like a whole rat's nest of issues very quickly if you decide to try to like ignore this and be like, oh, I don't know. I don't have a good explanation for how I emailed you or why I emailed you. It really requires companies to kind of have their story together and be able to say in the email, like, I'm emailing you because here's where we got your data. Here's a link to our privacy notice. Here's the unsubscribe link if you want to never be emailed again from me, right? And you're gonna have to be able to explain, like, yeah, this is how we got your email, right? And oh yeah, it was on the up and up.
So one question that kind of rises in my mind here is, I do a lot of outreach for purposes aside from just directly wanting to sell something today, right? So there's a lot of like relationship building that I see as kind of like the building blocks of building up to an eventual sell. Can you reach out to someone over email, one-on-one direct email with a purpose that isn't to sell something?
Yeah, so there's a couple exceptions. If you're talking about, okay, so you need this thing called consent, right? So the e-privacy directive restricts the legal basis for being able to send unsolicited emails and requires that you have this legal concept called consent. And GDPR is specific about what consent means. That's in Article 7. If you want to go back up and check out what it means by consent. Basically, consent has to be freely given. There can't be any penalty. You can't like condition other things on consent. You have to be able to withdraw consent. It has to be specific. But like once you have consent, you're allowed to like talk to somebody and interact with them, and like you're allowed to do whatever run a drip campaign, whatever you want to do. It's fine. You just need to be able to every time in every communication with them, give them the ability to take the offering. And so, but once you get consent the first time, the consent is for the use that you're going to put it to. So if your use is like run engagement campaigns, communicate product updates to our audience, let them know about like blog posts and newsletters, each of those might be separate use. You get consent the first time and you can feel free to, engage with them, within the confines of that use. What you can't do is take that data that they, their email address or something that they consented to and go use it for something else, like selling it to a marketing firm or something like that. You can't do that stuff. So yeah, you can feel free to build a relationship. It's just you can't contact somebody totally unsolicited with no existing relationship. There's a separate interesting question of how do you get consent in the first place? And this is really important because this helps.
And this has been really popular in the chat too, is that, is it okay to reach out and disclose, I saw you on LinkedIn, or, I found your email from Voila Newbert, like all these tools, right? What's that about?
Well, I mean, you can disclose how you built it, but like emailing them in the first place, just saying, hey, this is how I got your email address doesn't, like they didn't consent to you emailing them in the first place. So sending them an email is immediately violating the data protection law here by saying like, oh, just because you say like, here's how I got your email, imagine it from the perspective of a lead and they're receiving this email from you and it's like, I didn't consent to you getting in my inbox. You're invading my inbox, basically. I'm taking a really like caustic view of this, but I'm trying to think of somebody, the kind of person who might be likely to file a complaint, right, with a data protection authority. You're like, just, be like an activist about this. Be like, I never consented to you. I don't care if you got my email from LinkedIn. I don't care. Like, I never consented to this, period. And you have to have consent. That's true. That is true. You do have to have consent. So yeah, it doesn't really matter whatever you say at the beginning of the email. What it does matter is that you do have to disclose to them who you are, what organization you're with, and you should probably link them to your privacy policy and an opt-out in every communication, right? So you have to be like clear. It's called fairness and transparency. That's one of the principles. Again, if you go back to Article 5 in GDPR, at the beginning, Article 5, paragraph 1 lays out lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And then that's sort of elaborated later, especially in Articles 12 through 14, which deal with what you have to tell people whose data that you have about them.
And I think I interrupted you a couple minutes ago. You were about to explain how you get consent in the first place. If you're not doing content marketing to get people to opt in, like, does this totally eliminate outbound selling to EU people?
Yeah, well, so there's a couple different ways. So number one, you can still buy lists and you can still build lists, but you have to be able to show. It's almost like wow, what are those forensic shows on TV? I have to admit I don't watch them, like NCIS or something.
Like CSI or something.
Yeah, like CSI. You have to be able to show the chain of custody, basically. chain of custody is not the right word, but basically, if you're going to use a list, you got to be able to. Metadata has to come with the list showing where the consent to email this person was collected and when it was when it was collected and how it was collected. So just buying a list is not good enough. You actually need to be able for each list to show that you have a legally valid consent to be able to email that person. If that's what you want to do, if you want to email them, then you're going to need consent. So that's one way, but like that's really tough. I'm guessing that that's kind of going to get harder and harder and less common in Europe. Another way to get consent, so obviously running any kind of like content campaigns or content, campaigns is a good way to do it. If you have any kind of, there's an exception. So normally consent needs to be a clear, specific action taken voluntarily by the data subject, and you need to be able to prove that that action was taken voluntarily. That's why an opt-in for consent is kind of the gold standard, because they had to take some action to indicate their consent. There are some cases in which you can use an opt-out. So there's an exception, and there's a good, I'm going to drop a link because this is so good. I'm going to drop a link to the best resource that I've found in the world on direct marketing. And not many people necessarily know about this.
And would this be maybe sort of like an acceptable replacement for outbound selling process?
So the way that the opt-out process, you have to have an established relationship with the customer first. So it's really something that you can do in a product flow. It's really probably better suited for customer success and re-engagement teams, or upsell or cross-sell opportunities. It's probably not going to be super useful for most companies in terms of like contacting somebody for the first time. What you have to do, so the exception, and if anybody is interested, this is Article 5, Paragraph 3 of the e-privacy directive, talks about basically the requirement for consent to contact people, and then this opt-out exception. If in every country, again, I mentioned that the data protection directive and the e-privacy directive, any directive in EU needs to be passed into law in every member state. And they all have implemented these rules separately. So here's the deal. Every country has implemented the opt-out rules, the opt-out exception here, called sometimes a soft opt-in or an opt-out. They've kind of implemented this differently. So for example, if you're in Norway, and you're selling a customer in Norway, you actually need to close the sale before you can soft opt in or opt out them from receiving that customer from receiving for future communications. In the UK though, you don't need to actually close the sale. It's just enough to like get a quote from somebody. So if you have a form that says contact us for a quote, you can have a opt out that says when you submit this quote, unless you check here, we're going to send you marketing emails and sales emails too. That kind of thing. But in the UK, the rules are different. It doesn't need to be a closed deal. You could just be anybody who comes to you to solicit information from you. In Norway, it's totally different. You have to close the sale, and it's different in every country. It's kind of a huge mess. A lot of, again, if you're not selling specifically, there's a problem with Brexit in the UK and the ICOs, which is the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, and their guidance. But man, they have a lot of good guidance, and a lot of companies are probably going to use the UK.
We're going to include links to all of this, by the way, in the blog post that's going to be on the Closed Out blog here in a few hours. And we'll include the recording of this too if you have to hop out. That's okay. But Chas, I want to sum something up, because I've been seeing more and more questions in the Q&A and more questions in the chat about this. If I collect a list of leads, doesn't matter where the source comes from, LinkedIn, Hunter.io, Voila, Newbirth, scraping data sources, just going to companies' websites, looking for info at, company.com. Am I correct in saying that it doesn't matter where you actually source the emails from? You cannot send unsolicited cold emails to those lists unless they've opted in to your communications already.
Close. They need to have consented to receive emails from somebody sometime. So if the nature of their consent was from some other company, like 3 hops over, and you bought this list and they just consented to receive, I don't know, maybe you're a fintech company and they're like, yeah, I want to send me offers on loans or something. And they say, we may give your information to our partners and pass your information on. If they consented to that, which is like a fairly broad consent, that might be fine. You might be able to email them but the important thing is that you know that you have a consent that's sufficient to do what you want to do with that email. On the other hand, if you don't have any idea, if you know that these email addresses are from the EU and you don't have any idea whether you have consent or not, you don't. Under this principle, the accountability principle, which is where you're responsible for basically looking before you're leaping and making sure that whatever you're doing, that you can show that you've complied. And so, yeah, a lot of times if you just have a list of, this is, okay, so everybody here has probably gotten a ton of emails over the past week or two from companies who are like, oh, we updated our privacy policy, GDPR, right? And why are you getting those emails, right? So sometimes you get those emails and they're just like letting you know that they're ready for GDPR and that they have an updated privacy policy, and that's fine, right? Other times you go and they're showing you like a checkbox and you're like, oh, please consent to us sending you emails, because what they want to do is they want to continue to use you on their list, but they never got a proper consent. So you may have signed up for the product and stuff, but they never got an explicit, clear, separate consent to send, send me follow-up emails, send me, NPS scores, send me whatever. The reason why all these companies are trying to go back and collect consent is because they never had it in the first place. And after May 25th, they're not even really supposed to email you to ask you for consent, because even that's like, you don't have permission to email me. If you didn't have permission, emailing me to get permission is not an acceptable strategy here. So it's a chicken and egg. There's also both cookies are a huge headache for a lot of marketing teams, and email and stuff like this is a huge headache for a lot of sales teams. These rules are going to be clarified when the e-privacy directive is turned into a regulation. They intended to have it by Friday. It's not happening. It'll probably be sometime next year. So they'll try to fix some of the problems. And again, if we have links and time later, if you want to read about what some of the EU's acknowledged problems, there is a working group the history of the working group is less interesting. It's basically the group that's going to become the European Data Protection Board. They've been issuing guidance under the Data Protection Directive for years. It's called the Article 29 Working Party, and they have basically an opinion on all the ways that the e-privacy directive needs to be updated. And there's a great opinion on this, and the final text of the e-privacy regulation is in effect too. So we can look at what the rules will look like next year. But what's not going to change is that you're still going to need to be able to show anytime whether you acquired that consent directly or whether you acquired that consent, through some transitive property or some chain of acquisition, that basically you can act like the CSI, chain of custody, and show the proper handling of that consent all the way. You have to be able to trace the provenance of that email address and show that somewhere along the line this person agreed to this, to receive an email from you. And then when you do email them, remember, you got to give them the ability to withdraw their consent. That's a really important topic under GDPR.
Yeah. And so, one thing that keeps coming up in my mind is that this new regulation kind of destroys outbound prospecting, at least as we've understood it for the past several years, So what kinds of workarounds maybe can people come up with? Like, can I instead send someone a cold message on LinkedIn still? Like, is that still okay to do? Does this apply specifically to email, or does it reach into other networks and such?
That's a really good question. And this is something that's actually being addressed right now through I mentioned that the EU is kind of reworking this directive into a regulation. One of the things that applied inconsistently in the e-privacy directive was most of the regulation actually only applied to like telecom providers and not to like SaaS companies. So it's like it would apply to like AT&T, but not to like WhatsApp, for example. And it's like the EU has kind of recognized that like sending somebody like an SMS message versus sending somebody a message on WhatsApp, like the thing that the EU is trying to approach is platform agnostic. So be prepared. The answer today, right now, is that it's different in every country, but it specifically focuses on unsolicited electronic communications. It's not super, to my knowledge, widely enforced around what they call OTT, or over the top, or basically like SaaS platforms providers, but it will be soon. So you should probably plan on getting consent for all of your electronic marketing activities and any kind of unsolicited communication. Um, there might be specific differences now, but like by this time next year, or if you're thinking strategically, like where do we go with this and how do we set ourselves up for success, get consent.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a shift. The whole GDPR shift. A lot of people have said this is insane. This is what they intended. They intended to rebalance the ownership, essentially, and rights inherent in data between people, individuals, natural human beings, and companies, organizations. And GDPR, like any regulation, it's putting a thumb on the scale and saying, okay, companies can do all this stuff because there aren't any rules. They're gonna tilt it back in favor of people. It's going to be disruptive for a lot of small businesses, a lot of small, there are a lot of companies who are just like, I'm not going to recruit, hire, or go to market in Europe. That'll happen. The cost of compliance and the feasibility of compliance needs to come down at the beginning of any regulatory scheme. It's always like just massive shit show. Sorry. It's just like huge cluster. And then later things get like, there are better tools and better services, and everybody kind of understands how the regulation is going to be enforced. And there are vendors and consultants and people who pop up to be like, oh, clarify this, you're good, and really help teams. But with the outbound, the direct marketing piece, yeah, it's a game changer for sure, intentionally so.
Yeah. So another question that we've gotten a lot of in various different formats is, over the past year, 2 years, we've been building up lists of leads from, scraping data on LinkedIn, all these different tool sources, buying lists, whatever you want to call it. And let's say you have this list of, 10, 20, 30,000 prospects that you've built over the past couple of years. Can you still use that list if you did not sort of opt them in the way that GDPR mandates you to opt them in? Can you still use that list? Can you still email people starting Friday? Or do you have to go through that process of opting them in?
That's what we were talking about before. So what you're missing, remember, think about this, from every list, if you don't have any reason to suspect that list has anything to do with Europe, then set that aside. We're not talking about that. We're only right now talking about lists that you think or have some connection to Europe, or that they're European customers mixed in or something, right? So just to be clear, we're talking about EU data subjects going to market in the EU. In most of the United States, you can just build a list, scrape it, and fire off cold emails. That's fine. This is only when you have some reason to know that this list has something to do with the EU. Remember, every list now needs to have metadata with that list showing that you have permission to email them. And if you don't have that, then you don't have permission to that. Yeah, exactly. There needs to be affirmative showing of that metadata. So like you were saying, we have historical lists and they weren't collected in the right way. Well, even you might have if you're storing that list and keeping it around and then analyzing it and probably getting rid of it soon under GDPR, you can justify that storage probably under legitimate interest. Put up a notice on your privacy website, say, you may have rights. If we have your data, contact us, we'll let you know. And then, we'll let you know what your rights are with regards to that data. But if you want to email somebody, that's where the e-privacy directive says, hey, you need consent to do that act of emailing them. And so if you want to use that list and email them, you're still going to need consent. If you don't have the metadata in the list, you're going to be up a creek. And if probably the risk reward on this is not great, because if somebody is like, why did you email me? And you don't have a good answer, that's immediately can become just a huge headache for your team, your operations. You get a letter from a data protection authority. It's like, what are you doing? Show us your proof of compliance. It's like, no, it's not worth it. Probably not, at least until, it's probably not worth it.
So to clarify something that we've also gotten a lot of different forms of this question, I work exclusively in the United States, only US people do I ever outreach to. insert the name of the country, right? So Australia, Asia as a general area. Like if you're working in these areas outside of the EU, you can sort of continue as, business as per usual, as long as you're 100% confident that you're not reaching out to people based in the EU.
Yeah, so this is like a really good question. Where this is addressed for those who are reading along, if you want to see how this is covered and how this comes up in GDPR itself, this is in Article 3, which is called the territorial scope provisions. And this is also probably a good time to mention that there are, I'll drop a link here in the chat. The way GDPR works, it says the material scope of GDPR, which is like the subject matter of GDPR, is personal data. No restrictions, right? It's like anywhere, essentially. And then they limit that and they say, and it only applies to these kinds of organizations that have some kind of connection to Europe. You have to have some kind of connection. If you don't have any of these connections, there are 3 connections. You can have any one of them. If you don't have any kind of connection like this to Europe, then you're not, GDPR does not concern you. You are not within the territorial scope of GDPR. 3 ways to get pulled in. One is right in Article 3, paragraph 1. If you have an establishment, it's called an establishment in Europe. And that can be, it could be a headquarters, it could be an office, it could even be like a PO box and like a lawyer or something. There's a gradient, but basically any kind of established presence. There are court decisions that clarify like what does it mean to be an establishment. But if you have any kind of like presence in Europe, so the example you just gave, again, company somewhere else, not established, no headquarters, no office, no employees, nothing in Europe, they're not established. There are 2 other ways, and those are in paragraph 2. And those are the GDPR, the regulation itself in the article doesn't say this, but in the recitals, which are kind of like the color commentary to the regulation. The recitals are in the beginning. If you read the actual like published text of the regulation, the recitals are in the beginning where they go, whereas data protection is a good idea, whereas it's a fundamental human right, whereas like all of that stuff, those are the recitals. It's just 173 whereas. And they kind of tell you what the intent of the drafters was behind the article itself. So the recitals, especially recital 23 and recital 24, are really helpful in understanding the territorial scope of GDPR here. So there are 2 things that even if you're not established, if you're doing either of these 2 things, that pull you in. Number 1, if you're going to market in the EU, in the text of the article, they call it offering goods or services, irrespective of whether payments are required to data subjects in the Union. So you're trying to sell into the EU. Now the recital 23 clarifies, it doesn't mean if you just have like a website up and you have like a sign up form and somebody comes and they happen to be from the EU, you're not regulated. That's not going to be enough. If you have like language support, like just having like a website that's localized to Spanish in like you're in Mexico does not make you regulated in Spain, even though it's the same language, or like French in Haiti, that doesn't make you regulated in France. It's not enough. There needs to be some kind of evidence that you're going to market, and that's called targeting in the recital. The other thing is monitoring behavior of data subjects in the Union. That's called profiling. So any kind of like analytics, any kind of tracking for marketing teams, stuff like that. And that's again something where what is emerging is like if you want to make sure that you're not doing this and you're running like paid marketing campaigns or something, turn paid off for Europe. A lot of big platforms like Facebook and Aptible and stuff are letting you do that. And so that's something where you can make sure you're not actually like tracking or collecting people, building profiles on people in Europe.
So we've also gotten a ton of questions around inbound selling, right? So you have people that come to your website and do, one of a million different things. They opt in for an ebook. They opt in for your, newsletter. They opt in to get more info about your product, the contact us form. There's a ton of different ways that someone can kind of express an interest related to your business. So does it matter what people opt into based on what your next action is going to be? So if I subscribe to a newsletter, or if I, want to pick up an ebook, can my sales team also reach out to those people about purchasing our product, or does the scope of our relationship have to be confined only to that one specific, say, content request or something?
Yeah, good question. And this is what we were talking before. For anybody watching this later or watching the recording, rewind and go back to the part where we were talking about the data protection directive and gathering consent under the opt-out provisions. So this is different in different companies. Remember, Norway and UK have different rules on this. In the UK, which is more permissible, you're allowed to, as part of building a relationship with a customer, you're a prospect, right? You're allowed to opt them in. You have to give them a clear chance to opt out at the point of collection. But what you could do is something like, sign up here for an ebook, and you say your name, email, and the sign up form for the ebook, and then on the button it'll say send me the ebook. That's collecting consent just to send them the ebook, and you'll be good. It's clear, it's specific, but you're only allowed to send them the ebook with that. You can't do anything else with their data, because the only thing that they've actually given you permission to do is send them the ebook, right? What if you want to do something else? What if you want to send them up for a newsletter, or be able to send them a re-engagement, campaign later or something, or send them another ebook, a related ebook that they might be interested in? The rules are this again. The rules for this are different in different countries, but in the UK, and using something called the soft opt-out, you can say right above the sign up button, say something like, by having us send you this ebook, you agree, you consent to receive further emails from us about marketing related products or services. And you can either have it checked in, or you can say, check this to not receive it, or you can do a radio button that says, yes, I agree, no, I don't agree. Anything that's clear and specific. The difference is almost all of the rest of the time, if you don't have a prior relationship with somebody, you're required to only use opt-ins to show this kind of consent, right? And so an opt-out, something where they're already in by default, if they're not taking a specific action, that's usually not enough to constitute valid consent under GDPR and under European law. So you're only allowed to use opt-outs when you're already establishing a relationship with them for something else. Now, again, in the UK, you can do it before a sale. In other countries, you can only do it post-sale. But if you're not specific enough, you can talk to your lawyers, but you can probably say look, this is valid in the UK. I don't have any reason to suspect that we have customers in Norway, but I know we have customers in Britain, so we're going to follow the ICO's guidance on this. That's probably a good strategy. So the importance of inbound, just to encapsulate everything, inbound is super important and an awesome way to generate leads and to get consent to do other things with leads, as long as you have the right kind of forms. Basically, you're going to want to go back and revisit your forms and say, okay, you're signing up for an ebook. Can I also sign you up for this newsletter or something else? And then collect that consent and be able to track that.
So thinking like the marketer that I am, I've seen a lot of people updating their forms, their ebook sign up forms, to have a little checkbox that says, I consent that it's okay to send me XYZ on top of that. And that's where I think the stuff is sliding in, where people will use it for sales, engagements, other types of things. But is it okay to have that checkbox be mandatory in order to allow people to submit their information? So I want to make sure that everyone who gets this ebook is opted in to, allow me to do other things with.
Yeah, no. The answer is no. It's not allowed. You're not allowed to condition it. Consent doesn't work. It's not valid consent. It's not real consent if it's not freely given, and you have to be able to separate the granularity of uses out. So a consent has to be, it's recommended that a consent be specific for each purpose. And if they're consenting to sending you an ebook, for example, that's a separate, sending them a marketing newsletter is a separate use. It's clearly something that somebody, would say, it's not just we can market to you. Yeah, you consented to any kind of marketing from us. That's not the way that the rules are going in Europe. They're going to be more trending towards more specific. Now, some companies are saying, oh, we need to collect consent for every single segment integration that we drop. We need, Google Analytics and Mixpanel and HubSpot and blah, blah, blah. And they have these web forms that are popping up cookie consent for all these different cookies. That's probably radical overkill. But there's a reason why they're doing it. And that reason is related to guidance about the granularity of consent, which is not the same as what we're talking about here, which is like an inbound lead and what they're signing up for, but it's related in that the actual ways that you're going to use their data are separate. And if you're collecting consent, you need to have separate consents for separate uses. Now, that's not to say that you can't collect, so for example, if somebody signs up and you say, I'm going to sign you up for a newsletter, it's not to say that like you have to use MailChimp always. And when you switch to SendGrid, the consent isn't valid. Like they consented, you can send them a newsletter. However you send them a newsletter, you can send them a newsletter. That's the use that they're consenting to. But just like Omnibus, we're going to market to you, is generally frowned upon. And there is like I mentioned this before, a great guide put out on direct marketing. I'll drop the link right now. This guide is awesome. It's really, really helpful to help teams understand, at least in the UK, rules around direct marketing. Now, one heads up, the UK is soon to be not part of the EU. And the guidance on here is specifically UK specific. They have a separate regulatory law that's going into effect. The UK law is called the Data Protection Act, and they're updating it, but they're trying to keep it as consistent with GDPR as possible. So just know when you read this, just as a heads up, the laws are slightly different in the UK, but this is a really, really good guide to direct marketing. And if you're thinking about email campaigns, especially, and how to get consent, there's a whole section in here, pages 19 through 34, that specifically deals with what to think about and guidelines for consent in the context of building lists or doing inbound. Inbound is the way to go though, as opposed to like building and scraping. That's why I was saying before, like what you're going to see with GDPR is a big shift towards like content strategies and teams that can actually articulate some other kind of value to gather people and to get them in a place and build an audience and then get consent to market to them later. That's pretty much going to be the dominant model of marketing that's going to emerge from GDPR. Because
right.
how else?
And I keep seeing the questions too in the chat and in the Q&A section about, how do we contact new prospects? How do we do outbound? And I think that this can't be stated enough that the intention of this regulation is to cut down on the unsolicited outbound outreach, right? So you have to turn to more opt-in based strategies to get people interested in your product. And I think that's where, obviously the things like content marketing, webinars, these types of events are opportunities to get people to opt in to your messaging first. And that seems like, to me, the spirit of the law is get people to proactively opt in before you send them, sales related communications.
Yeah, and that's exactly where Europe is going with this under GDPR, the e-privacy. So professionals call this the e-privacy instrument. It's a directive now. It'll be a regulation later, but whatever that is, there are more specific rules, especially for sending emails and for any kind of like tracking, analytics, cookies, anything that relies on basically pulling information from a device. And so those rules are going to be, more specific. Europe is basically cracking down on marketing to people without, being able to show specifically that they agreed to be marketed to.
So one question that we saw a few times in our submission form here that I thought was really interesting was, what if I meet someone offline, right? Trade show, event, meetup, networking, whatever that may be. And they asked me to follow up with some information about my product, my service. How do you prove the consent in that case?
You can, so again, whenever you build that list, whatever you decide is going to be your source for building that list, you want to make sure that your source for building that list can also track metadata about where that consent was gathered and how it was gathered, and just be prepared to show that and prove that. Again, the UK guidance is pretty good about what constitutes consent. A lot of the stuff is online, but if you're doing it in person, you can just say, like, I met Jim at a trade show. He asked me to follow up with him. Like, good.
Cool. That's helpful.
So another question. The rules around having to obtain consent only apply to unsolicited communication. So if you meet somebody in real life and you're like, send me an email, like, that's a solicited communication. You just want to make sure that when you do email them, that you know that they asked for it. So that this is a distinction where you asked before, like, what's the difference between sending somebody like something from Gmail and sending them some massive 10,000 person drip campaign or something like that. There's no difference in the law in the tools that you use, but if you're sending somebody an email from your Gmail account, but it's possible that like they actually asked you to send them an email, or they expected that you would follow up with them later. And as long as you can just show that that was the case, and so that they're not. So if there's like if there's a guiding principle to any of this, it's avoid surprises. When you email somebody, avoid surprises. Do not surprise them. Do not make them wonder, why are they receiving an email from you, right? Or maybe they need a reminder, but like you should be able to like remind them easily, hey, you agreed to this.
Would it be a best practice then to document the met John at a trade show within whichever tool you're sending? So like that, next to their name, their email address, it says met at trade show, this date, requested information. Or is it enough to say like in the body of the email, hey, John, great meeting you at such and such trade show last week. Does that sort of count?
If you want to reach out to them again, I mean, yeah, that would be fine too, as long as you can prove it. Again, again, think about this from the perspective of the data subject, John or whoever, and he says, why did I get this email? Who are you? Right? You got to be able to respond to them and say, oh, we met at a trade show. So whether you put that in the email and that becomes part of your record, or whether you put it in, your CRM system or your lead system, doesn't really matter where it goes, as long as what's really important is that he agreed and you didn't surprise him. He agreed to receive an email from you at some point about something specific. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't count. Yeah, it doesn't count if like you meet somebody like this. Here's an example: like you meet somebody at a trade show, and then you go with your friend and like swap cards, and like you give him John's email to email. Like, did he consent to that?
Okay.
I don't know. You need to be able to prove it. So if it becomes just like, yeah, he said so, and John's like, I don't remember that, you're wrong, right? You need to be able to actually prove it. And that's where having like a record helps with that stuff.
Yeah, the burden of proof is on the controller of the data, essentially, the person doing the sending. So another question we've gotten a lot of too is that, does GDPR strictly sort of apply to, electronic communications in the sense of email, texting, or is it also sort of a knock for cold calling? A lot of our customers and people here today, I'm sure, pick up the phone and call prospects all the time. So are there any implications there for EU-based companies?
Yeah, absolutely. GDPR is not technology specific. It doesn't matter any time you're processing or using data in the EU for any purpose, the rules apply. The e-privacy directive specifically applies to cookies and tracking and emails and stuff like that. There's also a part about marketing calls, and I believe in that ICO guide I sent, starting on page 35 to 39, there's a whole section on marketing calling, and so you can read that. There's these call out boxes that explain how GDPR changes some of the stuff or how GDPR affects it. But yeah, the basic answer is even though we're outside the e-privacy directive, there are again more specific laws that deal with calling and stuff, and you're going to be in the same kind of situation. Things to watch out for: different nations have different do not call lists. You may have different sort of severity of consequences nation by nation with calling. You still need to be able to explain who you are, how you got their information, why you're calling. You need to be transparent and clear about that. You can't like, somebody's like, how did you get my information? And you're just like, hang up. Stay away from this one. Be aware that exposes you to quite a bit of risk if they want to follow up on that and figure out who you are and why you were calling them and why you didn't like tell them about their rights and oblige their rights under GDPR. So yeah.
And I just want to say for everyone watching, we're going to include all the links to everything Chas has mentioned here in the blog post that we'll be publishing within the next couple of hours. So if you want to do additional reading, which I highly encourage, then we'll include plenty of extra documentation for you. So we've got time for a couple more questions. Chas, one thing that I really know that I want to ask you has been, what is the risk of continuing to email people that you've collected without this GDPR compliant consent? What is realistically, what's going to happen if next week we're still reaching out to people, we're still cold calling, cold selling? What happens?
Yeah, we don't, there's some stuff in GDPR. There's a couple different liability mechanisms that are important. We don't know how any of this is going to play out though. So there's in Article 58, there's the data protection authorities, which are the regulatory bodies in each member state. So the ICO in the guidance I linked before, that's the DPA for the United Kingdom. Their CNIL is the one in France. They're named different things in different countries, but they're basically regulatory bodies. They have the ability to enforce GDPR. The ultimate sort of enforcement action is to really, it's people talk about the fines. Yeah, they're going to be fines, and some of them are going to be catastrophic. But what they can also do is they can just shut you down. They can say stop processing data, period, and they can just shut your business down. And so that's in Article 58. So there's basically the equivalent of injunctive powers. They can just be like stop under penalty of law. They can fine you for administrative fines for certain things. And then also that's in Article 83, if you want to read about that. And then Article 82, data subjects can sue you, and data subjects can get remedies in court. And we have no idea how any of these are actually going to play out. But that's the top-down answer. So like, what happens? What are the consequences? Well, here's the authorities, and here's like the potential consequences. Here's the bottom-up answer. What's going to happen is that if you run into somebody who knows what their rights are and doesn't want to receive emails, you may get into a tiff with them. You maybe get into a situation where they know their rights better than you do, and they're prepared to like go file a complaint or enforce that. How is that going to happen? How much is it going to happen? We have no idea. A lot of GDPR is similar. So there's a different shift actually in the American healthcare market. The HIPAA regulations, weirdly, are basically like a perfect echo for what's happening with GDPR. So before like 2009, only covered entities were regulated directly under HIPAA, so like hospitals, healthcare providers, and insurance companies, and the penalties were very low. And the regulators decided they want to increase the number of regulated entities, so expand the regulated entities and crank up the penalties. Same thing's happening with GDPR. And in 2013, when those regulations went into effect with HIPAA, everybody was like, what do we do? What's going to happen? Are they going to like take everybody's head off? What's going to happen with complaints? And that took several years to sort of shake itself out. We're in the same kind of position right now with GDPR. We don't really know if somebody files a complaint, how is it going to be followed up on? How diligent will it be? How onerous will the investigation be? I'm not really sure, but basically anybody can file a complaint, and that's going to be the main mechanism. And one of the things you have to do if you are processing data in the EU under Articles 13 and 14, depending on if you collect data from the data subject, you want to take a look at Article 13. If you collect data from some other source that's not directly from the data subject, you want to take a look at Article 14. And they basically tell you like what you need to tell people. Basically like what everybody, it doesn't need to go in your privacy notice, but everybody's putting it in the privacy notice. It basically outlines what needs to be in your privacy notice. What do you need to be able to tell people? And if you email somebody and you don't have a good story and you don't have a privacy notice, and you don't really have any evidence that you're actually like bothering to take this seriously, and they file a complaint, you may get a letter from a data protection authority at some point. I don't know what the chances are of that happening right now. And anybody who tells you that they do know, I don't know, we'll see. But you may get a letter that will have some questions that you'll have a really, really tough time answering unless you thought about this stuff ahead of time. There's a good post actually going around a while ago. There's a Hacker News post about a LinkedIn article, something called the Nightmare Letter, which is basically just a data subject writing you and asking to exercise all their rights. It's good to dig up. A lot of companies are looking at it being like, oh my God, this is a nightmare letter. This would be so hard to answer. And the answer is actually, if you've done all the prep work and you've organized, if you have an inventory of all the ways that you're using data in the EU and you've identified whether you're a controller or a processor, and there's some other stuff you need to figure out. But basically, if you get organized ahead of time and you're really clear about like what you're going to be doing with data, how you're going to justify it legally, including consent or otherwise, you'll be in much better shape. If you're reacting to this, the consequences are unknown and potentially company ending. I have a friend who calls it the headshot. If you've ever seen The Wire, so if the TV show The Wire, there's a fraudulent mortgage application. It's called the headshot because it's a federal felony, and it's just like something that like everybody does, and then goes and buys a house or something. In the Wire, Clay Davis, I think, is the one who does this. And it's a federal felony, and it becomes like the thing that like just ends your holding out against the police. It remains to be seen what the headshots are for GDPR, but they have the ability to shut you down and your business, catastrophically fine you. We just don't know how it's going to be enforced, what the granularity or evenness of enforcement is going to be, and the volume of enforcement. We don't know. So TBD.
All right. Well, Chas, that's actually all we have time for today. So we're going to send out the recording. We'll include a link to all the resources you mentioned. Chas Ballew, the CEO of Aptible, thank you again for joining us. And that'll do it, guys. If you have more questions, we're more than happy to connect you with Chas, his team. They have tons of answers around all these topics GDPR related. We're going to commit to showing you more resources as much as we can on the blog post coming out in a few hours as well. Chas, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And everybody, again, if you have questions we didn't answer, Ryan will follow up. You'll have the opportunity to ask and answer these questions in another forum. We'll give you a link to get in touch with us or get in touch with Ryan, so that I know we didn't even get close to answering all the questions that people had. There are answers in the video. So thanks everybody for participating.
Cool.
And thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.